about rhetorical purposes for repetition. So we're first going to talk about different types of repetition. Um, those are mostly useful for you when you're doing the reading part of the test. Um, and we'll talk about the purposes that an author might, why an author might repeat something over and over again throughout a piece. And then tacked on to the end, we'll talk about figurative language just a little bit, but that's going to be pretty perfunctory for a couple reasons. One of them is um, you already know most of this stuff, and the other one is that figurative language depends heavily on context, so there's really very little I can tell you. So let's get going. We'll talk about, I think, 4 different kinds of repetition. So the first is anaphora. Anaphora is repeating something at the very beginning of a series of sentences, clauses, or phrases. So there's an example there. This example of anaphora doesn't have any particular rhetorical purpose, I wouldn't say, other than to kind of create a rhythm, which is not something you really want to write about. Epistrophe is the opposite. It's repetition at the end of a series of sentences, clauses, or phrases. So same thing. Here, the word you is repeated always at the end of this of each line here. Good? All right. So, to kind of round out the place-based repetition, mesodiplosis is repetition of words or phrases in the middle of a series of phrases. And then anadiplosis is the repetition of something that ended the previous sentence at the beginning of the next sentence. So that's maybe the most complicated, but I think they're all fairly straightforward to understand. So repetition is done primarily for emphasis. So the first thing you sort of want to ask yourself as you're doing your close reading is essentially why would an author choose to emphasize this particular word or this particular phrase or what have you. If the word has, you're going to be talking about repetition. If you can name the sort of repetition that it is, like if you can say this is an anaphora, that's wonderful. If you just call it repetition, though, that's also fine. There's no particular need to get too specific. But repetition, like I said, is used primarily to emphasize something. Though you're talking about repetition, you're most often going to be talking about diction. So, for instance, a word with a very positive connotation is going to emphasize the positivity of the author. If you notice something repeated that is repetition could serve one of the rhetorical appeals. It could serve, an appeal to emotion or an appeal to logic. So repetition really has to be understood within context. But the question you want to ask yourself is, what is what is the micro purpose of this thing that is continually repeated? But for the most part, repetition is going to be done to emphasize something. So I'll give you 2 examples of kind of good and bad analysis of repetition. So in your analysis, it isn't enough to just name repetition as a device and then draw a conclusion. So the bad example says, in his farewell speech, Lou Gehrig uses repetition to connect with his fans and to encourage them to live life to its fullest. So that conclusion is not necessarily wrong, but it hasn't really broken down the use of the device repetition in the way that we would hope to see. So a better one is on the bottom. What you'll notice about this one is that it names the actual words that are being repeated, and the analysis is much more in-depth. So it says first, it names the thing that is being repeated. It names the device repetition. It names the function of that, right? Punctuating each thing with the familiar phrase. And then it draws a conclusion that punctuation kind of gives weight to all the blessings of his life, and that's what he wants his audience to focus on. So the second one is far better than the first one for all of those reasons. In the first one, there's no naming of the device. The analysis is really short, and though it's not something I disagree with, it's it's just not sufficient. So last thing, we'll talk very briefly about figurative language. So figurative language can be used in your rhetorical analysis. Metaphor, simile, personification, hyperbole, understatement. There are many more. These are kind of the easiest ones. For me, this is assumed knowledge. I assume that you know what these all mean. If you don't know what they mean, you can look them up in the dictionary, or you can, I guess you can send me an email if you don't know. I wish I had a better thing to say to you about figurative language, but I really have to tell you that the use of figurative language depends so heavily on context, in the context that it's being used, that it's almost useless for me to try to make a blanket statement about why an author uses figurative language. Some typical uses, though, are comparison, contrast, emphasis. So if you're thinking about, a simile, that's a comparison. And you have to ask yourself, why does the author want to compare, X to Y? If you're talking about personification, that's one that really depends heavily on context, but is often sort of an emotional appeal, right? Giving something a more human outlook, or giving it a more human character. So figurative language is going to be a thing. You should look for these devices in what you read, but you're going to have to sort of interpret each use of figurative language as you see it in that context. And the good news for you is that this is kind of what you've been doing right along in high school. So what you're looking at this time is, I believe, Florence Kelly's speech to women suffragettes, I guess. So what I want you to look for in that is the repetition. There are several phrases that come up kind of as a refrain, and think about why Florence Kelly would want to kind of insert those into her speech. So this is for rhetorical analysis exercise number 3. So that will be due. I'm posting this on a Thursday, and the date is the 25th. So we'll say it's due a week from today, if you can. And with the other one, that would be excellent. All right. So if you have any trouble, again, email me, or send me a message, or whatever. You can post in the comments. Okay.